Welcome to Guns, Guns, Gear, and Guns with Gary Gunderson. I am Gary Gunderson. Today I thought we would take a look at this opinion piece on CNN, which is very anti-gun, not only to have a good laugh at the author's expense, but also to kind of keep up to date with what the gun control crowd is saying, so you can have good counter-arguments at the ready. But really, if you are looking for a well-reasoned, intelligent piece, you're going to have to look elsewhere.
And there seems to be no sign of intelligent life anywhere.
Hello?
But let's go ahead and dig right in. This is America Once Valued Life More Than Guns. How Did That Change? By Dominic Erdozane. You can see right there, there's the little guy. What a fella. So he starts off lamenting the most recent mass shooting in Maine, and referencing Stephen King because, he is such an expert on this. But anyways, then he laments the fact that one of the students who survived the Parkland shooting and was a leader in that gun control movement has left the country for Scotland, where freedom is a reality and nobody lives in fear of guns. Let's check in on Scotland, shall we? Oh dear. Well, that's not good. It's almost like there's crime everywhere. And it's also funny that, Scotland actually does not have the same sort of freedoms and protections. Not just the Second Amendment, but also things like the First Amendment. Moving on, he talks about how that this is a new phenomenon, that this is not the American heritage or the will of the people. This is a political experiment by a militant minority. However, then he says, America has always had a gun problem, but never on this scale, which kind of goes against the previous paragraph that he says this is completely new. But, you can't expect consistency from one paragraph to the next. Then he moves on to speak of school shootings, which of course are always a tragedy, but these statistics are inflated. Last year there were 79, and so far we have 77 this year, but they include things like someone being injured on a tennis court who was hit by a stray bullet from an incident not even on campus, but nearby. And that goes down as one of these 77 school shootings. Not only that, they count people who go to a parking lot in the middle of the night and decide to unalive themselves. That counts as a school shooting, even though it does not have anything to do with students. It just is someone who was shot on school grounds, even if it was self-inflicted. Other years, I've also seen BB guns counted in this statistic as well. I don't know where they're pulling this from. It actually says it's pulled from 3 different sources: Gun Violence Archive, Everytown, and Education Week. But this is also a lot higher than, say, the Education Week, which only has about 40, less than 40 right now. So I'm not sure if he's adding them and if they actually cross-reference to see if these are additional ones. But I don't know why there would be such a variation unless they are just doing it to inflate their numbers. He moves on that no generation has endured this, and that these weapons have never been available till now, or the right to carry them outside the home were not around, and that's new. And that would have been unthinkable to Americans of any other era. And that most Americans of the mid-20th century abhorred the concept of preparatory armed carriage, which, no lie, that's a pretty sweet way to say concealed carry or carrying a firearm. Preparatory armed carriage. And shuddered at the sight of a gun in public. Yeah, that's true. And a lot of that was actually due to the political climate at the time, and a lot of laws banning public carry at the time were racist. It was due to groups like Black Panthers and others, and they were afraid when they saw some black people carrying firearms, so they made it illegal to do so. So, referencing that racist part, it's true, but, they kind of left that part out. And here he says something that will come into play later. Regulations against going armed were as old as the Republic and staples of common law. Now, this is something I will touch on again later, but that isn't true. If it was, they would have no issue with the Bruin decision from the Supreme Court last year, because that has a test of analogous historical laws about banning firearms in certain ways. So if this was true, then they wouldn't have Bruin. The Bruin decision would actually bolster their position, and they wouldn't have an issue with it. The fact that they do have an issue with it proves that this is not real. In 1959, the majority of Americans favored a total ban on handguns. This is true. Handguns were seen as the bigger threat, and technically they still are, and they account for more homicides and suicides overall. And this is also kind of funny considering now the primary target is obviously things like the AR-15 or other modern sporting rifles. Then he uses historical authority to talk about people from history who were against firearms, wanted to ban, handguns. Milton Eisenhower, chairman of commission, talks about Richard Nixon, who wanted to ban handguns, which is, great. It's the only time you'll see a left-wing person reference Nixon in a positive light, that's for sure. Then he talks about some areas that actually did vote to ban handguns citywide, and that years later, that same jurisdiction, apparently with the same mayor 40 years later, was trying to keep them off crowded buses and had given up ground as far as allowing people to carry firearms in general, which is a good thing for freedom-loving Americans. And then he does the common thing where, the Republicans are trying to remove gun-free zones from schools and other gun-free spaces. That's because law-abiding people will not shoot up schools. So letting them carry a firearm there would not be an issue, because if someone's going to shoot up a school, a sign saying it's illegal to have a gun there will not help. The funny thing is then he actually blames all of this, the proliferation of firearms rights, handguns, AR-15s, on Ronald Reagan, who famously helped with the Firearms Owners Protection Act and ended any new automatic firearms or machine guns in the U.S., but unless you have a post-dealer sample and all this other junk. So it's kind of interesting that he blames Reagan for everything, considering he was not that pro-gun. And then, has a quote, "Only a madman could look at the problem we have in this country and then say that what this country needs is to weaken our handgun control laws." From Michael Beard, head of the National Coalition to Ban Handguns, an unbiased source. Then he goes into the history of concealed carry laws and how they haven't been around that long explicitly, and that, start out with one in Florida that was overturned, then in Texas, and that in 1986, only one state, Vermont, allowed concealed carry without a permit, and that now 27 states allow it. And, this is one of those gun control arguments thing. They like to say permitless carry or unrestricted carry. A lot of actually pro-gun people will say constitutional carry. I will say either way, because I don't really care, because either way, you should be able to do it. And then he also talks about how, some states are shall issue now, and really all of them are after Bruin, though some of them are still explicitly going against Bruin with pernicious laws that defy the Supreme Court and will go back to the Supreme Court for a new ruling. And laments that training requirements for concealed carry are being widely abandoned, which is obvious if you're going to have these constitutional carry states. How can you require that? But, this guy's obviously not the brightest in the bunch. Then he talks about the stand your ground laws that eliminates the duty to retreat, which is duty to retreat, if you're not aware, is a terrible form of law in regards to self-defense, because, even if you're like knocked down on the ground and, you shoot someone who's standing over you, some prosecutor could still come at you and say, well, you still could have got up and got away. They're just trying to make a scenario instead of just saying, well, your life was threatened. That person was threatening your life was threatened. You have the ability to defend yourself. And there's not some weird judgment call that's completely arbitrary that someone can make. He then references that the stand your ground became fashionable in the late 19th century, which is kind of interesting that he references a Supreme Court case in 1895, because that would actually imply that this has been around a long time. But apparently the court did also say something that was close to duty to retreat right after saying they had the right to stand their ground, essentially. But it's not really one way or another. And it really does show that this does go back into the past a lot more than he is insinuating. I also don't understand what he means by it was derided as a holdover from the slave power. There's no link for an explanation there. I would like one because I don't know what he means. Then finally, machine guns. Oh, and I forgot to bring up, this is going to be important. He talks about how this was a culture war in which facts were optional and reality negotiable. Keep that in mind on this next machine gun section. You can probably guess where this is going. He talks about in the 1920s, the Tommy guns, which led to the National Firearms Act by gangsters. And then he immediately moves into the clock tower shooting at the University of Texas with a quote-unquote sniper rifle. That such events used to be rare until the return of automatic firepower in the 80s. He then references a shooting in 1989 in which someone used an AK-47 pattern rifle, notably a semi-automatic rifle. So he goes into this whole section about machine guns when he is really referring to semi-automatic rifles. Once again, proving he doesn't really know what he is talking about. And then he talks about other people after the shooting wanting to ban them, and that the NRA was initially against the AR-15, surprise, before they came out in favor of it, and that, people buy them as an FU to the left, and that is 100% correct. I am fully convinced that if they had not passed the assault weapon ban in 94, which made them illegal to sell new ARs, AKs into the civilian market for 10 years, it would not be as popular today. Nothing makes an American want something more than the government telling you, you can't have it, and then it becomes fully legal again. Americans are going to take advantage of that and say, it must be pretty good if the government says you shouldn't have it. So that's on you. Plus, they are pretty great. And then he talks about his conclusion. This is not freedom. It's the unraveling of the American promise of peace and domestic tranquility. It actually is freedom, not only allowing people to defend themselves, but also allowing them to purchase firearms that they please. I still think that there are way too many gun laws on the books, and they are already violating the Second Amendment, but that's just me. He then mentions the Supreme Court decision that's under consideration, the Rahimi case, in which someone who had some domestic violence charges is going up to the Supreme Court because there has been no historical analogous laws that would prohibit his capacity to have a firearm. And then he talks about how that history cannot be denied. This constitutional right to own a gun for self-defense is another product of our times, a right unknown before the Heller decision. Well, like I said before, Bruin, you have to bring in historically analogous gun laws to justify restrictions. If it was not a new thing, a product of our times, if it was a product of the founding, at the time of the founding, Democrats would be all over this in states, using analogous laws to pass gun control. Unfortunately for them, the only ones they can find are racist ones against Native Americans, black people, sometimes Catholics, and that's not really a good basis. You're using racist laws to argue gun control. That's what these people are doing in various states because there is no other historically analogous laws for the type of gun control they are trying to pass. For decades, gun activists have claimed history for their radicalism, framing gun control as a failure of patriotism. It is. But this is an imagined past, a brutalized freedom, and one that is tearing American communities apart. And then he finishes with an FDR quote, which is actually probably weaker. This is probably a better paragraph, even though it's a complete lie, like I've discussed. Anyways, that's all for this nonsense of an article. What do you think? Do you think he made any good points? Do you think this is kind of the new tact for gun control arguments? Just trying to say that there is historical precedents for their gun control laws, which they have and a complete inability to produce? Let me know your favorite part of this article in the comments below. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and if not that, join our Discord, like the channel, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others to help the channel grow. Thanks for watching.